Images. In fact, folks, of course, this weekend the nation was rocked, and we were reminded of the differences between peaceful protests, riots, and then sheer anarchy. Professional anarchists played a major role in changing the tenor of these protests, and sadly, images of violence and looting will be part of the legacy in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. But I still think that there can be a positive outcome. You know, the composition of the crowds in those peaceful protests are mostly younger people of all races. They want to make a difference. There are now many more forums for discussion and solutions, and it really comes down to the basic, really, respect and more honesty. The ability to have empathy while erasing negative preconceptions and assumptions that really are just a cover for treating people differently. Yesterday, by the way, was the 4th anniversary of my mother passing away. She was born and raised in Uniontown, Alabama, where there was brutal mistreatment of blacks. She taught me not to hate, but to fight back. She taught me that things would be unfair, but that I could make them better. I happen to think those ideas are actually the essence of America, to be and get better, and it always will happen if there's a deliberate and unified effort. I actually believe we could actually go from here and find ways to really come out of this better. Ironically, I think it will happen if we can muffle the voices and power of politicians and the media. On that note, I'd like to bring in Fox News host, Nation host, David Webb, along with former NFL player Jack Brewer. Jack, let me start with you because the epicenter of all of this is your hometown.
Yeah, right in Minneapolis, where I went to college. Played for the Minnesota Vikings proudly, was a captain on both of those football clubs. So those streets that you see are streets that I became a man on. And when you look at some of those businesses, I have 3 restaurants in that town that all got vandalized. So it's really disheartening to see this at this moment. You know, Minnesotans are known as Minnesota nice. And when you go there, people embrace you with love and care. But to see what this has done to this nation, to see how you take a man that was all about peace and you change this thing, and now it's all about looting and rioting. And so, you know, I just keep saying this, Charles, this is spiritual. Evil and racism is spiritual. To go out and loot is spiritual. And we have to fight spiritual wars in the spirit, and we can't just fight it with flesh. It's not going to be solved with political parties and our politicians who want to just talk about how their policies are better than one another. This is a deep-rooted issue, and we reap what we sow, and we got to go back and have some reconciliation now.
You know, David, one of the narratives on the media throughout, no matter where I toggled the channels, was the notion that there's systemic racism in our police forces, not the notion that because these are human beings, there's going to be an occasional bad apple. I still believe it's the occasional bad apple, but by the same token, I grew up with the blue line of the blue wall of silence and things like that. There can be improvements. Where do you see this going?
Well, Charles, and actually, I'm going to begin with what you said about how you were raised. And I was raised with the same values, that there are challenges, there's unfairness, there's racism, it's real, there are other things out there in life, but we have that opportunity to make it better, and I think that is a message that's needed here. We just see a contrast in the last few minutes between George Floyd's brother and the vigil that he's holding, and these rioters that are out at night, the pretext being the protest, then they go out and go further. So systemic racism does not exist in the police departments. If we look at the track from the late 60s to now, we've seen a significant change in that. The blue line, that blue wall of silence, has been, you know, all but done away with. It still exists from time to time. But rather than deal with the honesty and the data, the statistics, the facts, and the difference between police brutality, which this clearly is, and possible, if there's possible that it's racism, that will be an element we may or may not discover in time. That's how we need to approach these things. But what's happening now is detrimental to all communities, certainly detrimental to a lot of these black communities where they're literally burning their own communities. And we may see riots in the economy become a headline when it's the destruction of the local economy, which, you know, Jack knows this, the destruction of local lives, of your educational future, your economic future, your spiritual future. You know, we're having a value fight in this country, and a cultural fight, and it's not drawn along color lines. It's drawn along ideologies that are fundamentally against, you know, the simple principle, Charles, of there's only one race, it's human.
You know, just earlier this morning, former President Barack Obama penned a very intriguing op-ed in Medium. It is titled, How to Make This Moment the Turning Point for Real Change. Now, Obama lays down some of the lessons from the past that he says are worth remembering. But one thing he talks about, Jack, is the elections that matter at the local level. And I'm scratching my head saying, well, these elections at the local level has always been your party, right? They've always been, for the most part, Democrats who have been in charge of this. And then, of course, over the weekend, we saw the Minnesota governor blame white supremacists on, so this is why I'm leery of politicians and their role in this. And I think it's got to be something more grassroots.
It does, and it's really sickening. I tell you, you look at Minnesota and you see the makeup of that city, and you see an AG that's African American, and then you see and you look back and you see that this man had 17 violations, and they kept him on the police force. And the fact that they're not highlighting that, and then for them to make up the lie that the majority of these looters were coming from out of town, and then it comes out that over 80% of the people arrested were actually from Minnesota. So these are the issues at the local level. Obama was right. It does take local leadership. But when local leadership is wrong, you got to call it out. Otherwise, you're just putting off the inevitable again and letting this spiritual evil war continue in society. And David was spot on. Right. This is a cultural war right now, good versus evil. Charles, you look at these kids. These kids are taking selfies and going on Instagram Live in front of burning businesses that are needed for the poor people in Minneapolis, that the underserved people in Minneapolis are going to depend on these same businesses. And these kids don't have any soul in them, right, and they're taking selfies to get praise on social media. It's sickening.
So real quick, David, I'm running out of time, but I want to give you the last word. Your thoughts on the solution. How do we make it better? This is not the first time we've been here in my lifetime. It's the 68, it's just, and even the blackout in 1977. We've seen these acts before, but how do we fix it in these days?
First, we have to recognize that this didn't happen overnight in Minneapolis. It took many failures to get us to this point, especially with these liberal progressive policies and the failures in these cities failing on education and economics. And then we have to look at a long-term solution, not an overnight or a one-election solution. Recognize it for what it really is. Start working on it, but go local. You know what? That's true, but don't elect leaders who fail you time and time again.
It's just crazy. You keep electing the same people with the same policies, and guess what? You get the same outcome. David and Jack, thank you both very, very much. Really appreciate your insight always, but more so today.